Hello, we are Tim and Heather Paul. We're sitting here in our living room at our home here in Knoxville, and we just wanted to take a minute to shoot a quick video and share with you our story a little bit. Today is an extremely important day in the life of our family. Today is February the 19th, 2016, and 10 years ago on this very day, February 19th, 2006, our lives pretty much changed forever. That was a Sunday evening, February the 19th, 2006, and since I work at church, I had to be there a little earlier that night, so I'd driven separately from Heather and our then 4-year-old daughter, Kaitlin. After church, we went out to have dinner with some dear friends, Jim and Dee Brogan and Rachel Morrison and their families, and we got done with dinner and it was time to go home. Well, Heather and Kaitlin left first, and I was 3 cars behind them, and I think Rachel was one car behind Heather, maybe, and the Brogans were maybe in the turn lane. And the light turned green, and I heard an incredible explosion. And I looked up and I saw Heather and Caitlin's car going sideways. They had been T-boned on the passenger side by a driver who was more than twice the legal limit drunk. And he also had 2 passengers in his car who were also twice the legal limit. They hit Heather at approximately 70 miles an hour without any braking, according to the investigation. And of course, you can imagine my complete panic and fear. I pulled around the cars that were in front of me and drove over. They landed in a little grassy area. I pulled over there in my truck and hopped out, and I'll never forget the first thing I heard was Kaitlin, our 4-year-old daughter, screaming in ways that I'd never heard before or since. I'll never forget the sound of that screaming. I got her out of the car, and she had a few little cuts and scrapes from some glass, but she was doing well. She was okay. I took her out of her car seat and handed her to Dee Dee, who was there. Dee Dee took her to her car, and I went back to Heather. When I got to Heather, it was a pretty rough scene. Heather had been, even though she was hit on the right side, it had slung her body. The force had slung her to the right side of the car, and the actual right side of the car was caved in almost to the center of the car. And the right side of her head had hit the door really hard, so much so that when she came back, it actually peeled scalp from her head, and it was stuck to the side of the car. You could still see hair hanging down. And when I got to her, she was obviously covered in blood, and she was hunched over, and she wasn't breathing. And went into panic mode, but also tried to think rationally as I could and try to figure out what to do. And so I was screaming for her to breathe, and so finally I decided I needed to do mouth-to-mouth. And so when I put my hands down to raise her head up to help her, so I could do the mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, she actually started gasping for air, and it was very labored, but she was breathing. So I just kind of held her head there and just waited for the EMTs, the medical team to get there, and the whole time just praying, asking God not to take her. There was obviously blood all over me, running down my hand, my arm as I was holding her head, and it was a crazy scene, and one that I'll never ever get out of my head. Paramedics came and attended to Heather. Actually, there was a gentleman in the other car who was killed. The driver of that car was charged with vehicular homicide as well as vehicular assault on my family. And then we went on to the hospital with Heather. And to be honest with you, bracing myself to find out that she probably wasn't going to make it. The doctor came out and told me that it didn't look very good. Her vital signs were actually doing well, but they almost called her brain dead because of very limited activity in her pupils when they shined a light. They were not going to call her brain dead, but it was very limited, and she was as near death as you could be. And it was a crazy time. We found out the next day, neurosurgeons came in and talked with me and so forth, and one of the things they told me was that the kind of brain injury that Heather had, 30% of the people who have that kind of brain injury would die at the scene of the wreck. Another 30% would die in the hospital. Another 30% would be basically in a vegetative state the rest of their life, unable to move or function. And then 10% of those people that suffered that type of injury would possibly have some level of recovery as far as being able to be rehabilitated to some level. So it didn't look very good. The prognosis was very bleak. Obviously, Heather did well as far as vital signs did well, and physically she actually stabilized. But with the brain injury, she was in very big trouble. And the thing about it is, there was nothing that they could do. There was no surgery. There was nothing that they could do to fix the brain injury. I'm the kind of person like, can we just give her a pill? Can we do a surgery or something and just go home? And unfortunately, the kind of brain injury she had, where a lot of the connectors in her brain were actually torn, there was nothing that could be done. What did happen was an amazing thing. Thousands of people were praying for us all over the world. We had a CaringBridge page set up, and people all over our community and our church, around people that we knew just from our childhood, as well as people all over the world we'd never heard of before, found out about it and just started praying for us. We started seeing things happen. We actually had specific things we prayed for. When Heather, they did the first MRI on her brain, there were spots on her brain that the neurosurgeon said was called anoxia, and it's from lack of oxygen because she was really struggling to breathe. And we asked people to pray about that, and the very next MRI they did, there were no more spots. No other explanation. There was nothing they did medically for her. Things like that happened throughout this whole process. And over time, gradually, Heather started to get better. Heather had to learn how to walk again, how to talk again, had to remember things like who I was, our daughter's name, what city we lived in. It was basically starting from scratch. But as you can see, Heather's made a remarkable recovery 10 years later. In fact, that year, the wreck happened in February. By October, she was cleared to drive. After being told that she was probably going to spend the rest of her life in a nursing home, that was kind of what the doctors were thinking, that we would have to go visit her every day or weekly, and she'd be fed by a feeding tube, to several months later being able to drive. It's nothing short of a miracle. Medical doctors, that's what they said, it's a miracle. There's nothing medically to explain this. There's no reason medically that Heather should be at the stage she was at then or now. But they call it, the medical doctors all called it a miracle. It can't be denied that God is the reason Heather's here today. And many of you don't believe that, and again, that's cool. But our faith is so strong, we know that God was with us every step of the way. Heather obviously was in a coma and was checked out a little bit, but I felt God's presence the whole way through. And the only way I could explain to you if you don't believe that, which is cool, is this. Think of it this way. What if you had spent your whole life living in a box? And I tried to explain to you this concept that there's a thing out there called the wind. And the wind moves and you can feel it on your face and you can see it blowing things around. And then you might ask me, well, what does the wind look like? And I wouldn't be able to describe to you what it looked like, but I would be able to say, I can see its effect, I can feel it. And you would have a tough time believing that there's such a thing as the wind. But if you stepped outside of that box and stepped outside and felt the wind, felt it blowing on your face and felt it blowing your hair and saw it swaying the trees and blowing the leaves, then you would absolutely believe in such a thing as the wind. Now, I know it's a little stretch of an illustration, but it's kind of the same way. I can't tell you what God looks like. All I can tell you is I feel His presence. I've seen Him move. I've seen Him work. And it's undeniably God. And we, as a family, realize that we're where we are now simply because God found favor and blessed us and healed Heather. People ask us, well, if you're such Christians, you're believers, well, why did God let you go through that? Or why did God cause that to happen? I'm reminded of the scripture in John chapter 9 where the disciples were with Jesus and they saw a blind man And they said, Jesus, why is that man blind? Is he blind because of his sins? Or is he blind because of the sins of his parents or his ancestors? And Jesus' response was really cool. He said, it's neither of those. He is blind so that the Father can be glorified through him, and that his mighty works can be seen through him. And then Jesus healed him, and God was glorified. And that's what we hope this story does. If we could vote, we would not have voted to go through this. We would not have asked for this. But we do want God to be glorified through it and honored through it. And we feel that because he has done what he's done with Heather and healed Heather, that's what we're going to do. We're going to honor him and glorify him because he's the only answer there is. He's the only reason that we're where we are now 10 years later. Anyway, we just wanted to take a minute to share our story with you. It's been 10 years. It's been an amazing 10 years. It's not been all smooth sailing. We've had our struggles. I still struggle sometimes because I remember so much about what happened that night so vividly. But what I do know is that God's been faithful. And because of God's faithfulness, we're where we are today for no other reason. We've had a lot of good friends who have helped us through it. Our church prayed for us, helped us get through some tough days. But ultimately, God has had his hand of favor on us and has blessed us more than anything we deserve. And all we want to do is give him the honor and glory for it, because he's the only reason that we can sit here today as a family and even share the story. So thanks a lot for just taking a minute to watch, and we hope God blesses you. And we are grateful for your friendship, and we're grateful for what God has done in our lives. Thanks a lot.